They put Della Mercer up on the auctioneer's crate the same way they would stack a sack of seed corn, a thing to be moved before it spoiled. A man at the back of the crowd, broad through the shoulders and still beneath a low gray hat, watched her without blinking and did not laugh with the others. It was the second Tuesday of October in the town of Coldwater, and the square smelled of wet straw and wood smoke, and the cold that comes down off the mountains before the first snow. 100 people had come, and most of them had come for the spectacle. There is a particular hunger in a small town for the public undoing of a woman it has already decided to be done with, and Coldwater had decided about Della Mercer a long time before that morning. She stood on the crate with her hands folded in front of her apron, and her chin held at the exact level of a woman who has made herself a private promise not to weep where they can see it. Her dress was black because she was a widow, and it had been good once. The hem was frayed now. The cold went straight through it. She kept her eyes on the false front of the feed store across the square, on the painted letters, on a knot in the pine board just under the eave, on anything that was not a face. Mr. Pruitt, the auctioneer, read out the terms in the flat voice of a man reading a stock notice. The county had a vendue that fall, same as every fall, for those who had become a charge upon the town and had no kin to take them. The able-bodied went to the highest bidder. Whoever bid the most paid that sum into the town fund, and in exchange he had the right to the labor of the pauper for the season, the work of their hands, in trade for a roof and what food a man cared to put in front of them. It was legal. It had been legal in towns like Coldwater for as long as anyone living could remember. That did not make it anything other than what it was. Widow Mercer, Pruitt read, 25 years of age, sound of limb, cooks, sews, keeps a house, husband deceased, debts outstanding to the estate, no issue. He glanced up over the paper. Don't let the black dress fool you. Somebody in the front laughed. The sound carried. Della had not always been a thing on a crate. That was the part nobody in the square cared to remember. 2 years before, she had come to Coldwater, a bride. Her husband had been a man named Carl Mercer, who had a quick smile and a quicker way of promising, and who had bought 80 acres of bottomland on a note he never had any honest intention of paying down. He had bought cattle on another note. He had bought a wagon, a stove, a parlor organ that Della had never once heard him play, all of it on the strength of his smile and the patience of one man in town who held the paper. Then, one morning in the second spring, Carl Mercer rode out to look at a piece of ground he meant to buy on yet another note, and his horse came back without him, and they found him 2 days later at the bottom of a coulee with his neck broken. That was when Della learned what she had married. The smile had been the only thing standing between Carl Mercer and ruin, and now the smile was in the ground, and the ruin was hers. The man who held the paper came to the house before her husband was decently buried. His name was Silas Crane. Crane owned the bank, such as it was, and the freight line, and a good part of the main street, and he owned the notes on half the failing outfits in the county, which was a kind of ownership of the people, too. He was not a large man. He was neat and gray and soft-spoken, and he wore good gloves, and he had a way of being sorry for you that left you colder than plain cruelty would have. He sat in Della's parlor with his hat on his knee and told her gently that the estate was insolvent, that the land would revert, that the cattle and the wagon and the stove and the parlor organ would be sold against the debt, and it would not be enough, and that left a balance, and a balance had to be answered for somehow, because the town could not be expected to carry a healthy young woman on the public charge. "There are arrangements," Silas Crane had said, turning his hat. "A woman in your position, there are arrangements that could be made privately, between the two of us, that would settle everything." Della had understood him perfectly. She had stood up out of her own chair in her own parlor and told him to take his arrangements and get off the place. It had felt, for one bright second, like the proudest thing she had ever done. It was also the most expensive. A man like Silas Crane does not forget being put out of a parlor by a woman with nothing. He went away smiling his sorry smile, and within the month the balance had been certified, and the town board had voted, and the widow Mercer, who would not be reasonable in private, was put up at the vendue to be settled in public. So now she stood on the crate, and the man named Silas Crane stood near the front in his good gloves, not bidding yet, watching her with the patience of a man who has arranged the entire room and is only waiting for it to do what he built it to do. The first bid was $1. It came from a rancher named Del Foss, who ran cattle east of town, and who said the dollar loud, with a grin thrown back over his shoulder to his friends, so they would know he was joking and not joking both at once. The crowd laughed again. $1, said Pruitt. "I have $1. $1 and 2 bits, said another man, and there was more laughter, because it was a game now. The price of a widow, and the lowness of the numbers, was the whole of the joke. They were not bidding for her work. They were bidding for the pleasure of saying out loud what they thought she was worth. Della kept her eyes on the knot in the pine board. She had decided she would not look at any of them. She thought, if she could just hold the knot in the board until it was over, until somebody owned the season of her hands, and the rest of them got bored and went home, then she could begin to bear it. That was as far ahead as she could see, to the next minute and the minute after that. $1.50. $2, and I'll work the black right out of her. That one did not get a laugh. Even Coldwater had a floor, and the man who said it, a teamster with red whiskers, looked briefly surprised at the silence, and then defiant in it. Silas Crane had still not raised his hand. He had a man for that, a clerk named Otis, who did his bidding in the literal sense, and the understanding in the square, unspoken and complete, was that the widow Mercer would go to Crane in the end, through Otis, for whatever low sum the joke ran out at, and that Crane would then have, by law and for the price of a bad supper, the very thing he had been refused in the parlor. People knew it. Some of them were ashamed of knowing it. Not enough of them. $2, said Pruitt. I have 2. Do I hear? The voice came from the back. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the kind of voice that has spent its life out of doors and learned to carry without being raised, and it dropped into the square and stopped the laughter the way a stone stops the spread of a ripple. The man at the back took a step forward so they could see him, though most of them knew him already, and the ones who knew him went quiet in a different way than before. He was tall and built heavy through the chest and arms, the way a man gets from 20 years of work and not from anything else. His coat was old and clean, his hat was gray and shapeless with weather. His face was brown and lined and still, and he had a short beard going iron at the edges, and his eyes were a pale, steady color that did not move off the auctioneer. His name was Roan Whitaker, and he ran a horse and cattle outfit 11 miles up the Coldwater road, alone, and the town had its own quiet verdict about him, too. 3 years before, Roan Whitaker had had a wife. Her name had been Ada, and she had died of a fever in the space of a single hard week in the spring, out at the ranch 11 miles from the nearest doctor, with the river up and the road washed out. Roan had ridden through the flood to fetch the doctor, and had come back, half drowned, with the doctor an hour behind him, and the hour had been the hour Ada died in. That was the truth of it. But truth travels slower than talk in a town like Coldwater, and the talk had been that Whitaker's wife had died alone out in that lonesome place because he kept her too far from people, because he was hard, because there was something shut and strange in a man who would live a day's ride from his own kind by choice. The talk had made him a figure to keep children away from. He came to town for supplies, and the smith, and nothing else, and he spoke to almost no one, and the town had read his silence as proof of whatever it had already decided. A hard man, a cold one, best left alone, and best left to leave you alone. So when Roan Whitaker said $5, the square did not laugh. It did two things at once. It went still with the surprise of it, and then it leaned in, because here was a fresh and unexpected spectacle laid over the old one. The cold widower buying the disgraced widow. And Coldwater had never in its life been able to resist a thing like that. $5, said Pruitt, recovering. He looked for one flecked instant toward the front of the crowd, toward Silas Crane and his clerk Otis, the way an actor looks toward the man who is paying for the play. Otis opened his mouth. $6, said Otis. $10, said Roan Whitaker, before the clerk had the breath back from the first word. A murmur went through the square. $10 was not a joke. $10 was real money for the labor of one woman for one season, more than the work would honestly fetch, and everybody there knew it, and everybody there began in that moment to understand that something other than a bargain was happening on the crate. Otis looked toward Crane. Crane's neat gray face had not changed, but his eyes had moved at last off Della and onto the big man at the back, measuring him the way a man measures a fence he had thought low and finds is higher than he judged. $15, said Roan. Up on the crate, Della had finally taken her eyes off the knot in the pine board. She was looking at the man in the gray hat now, the stranger spending real money on the season of a stranger, and she did not know what to make of him, and a cold new fear came up under the old grief, because she had only ever known one kind of man who paid more for a woman than her work was worth, and she had already turned that kind out of her parlor once. 18, said Otis, and there was a thinness in the clerk's voice now, a man working past his instructions. Roan Whitaker turned his head slowly and looked at Otis for the first time. Then he looked past Otis at Silas Crane, and he held the banker's eyes across the whole length of the square, and he said, without any heat in it at all, in that low, carrying voice, "And I'll go on past anything. Your man's got the stomach to say, Crane, so you might save us both the morning." The square did not breathe. Silas Crane looked at Roan Whitaker for a long moment. And whatever a banker weighs in a moment like that, the cost of the thing against the cost of being seen to lose it, the pleasure of winning against the danger of a public scene with a man twice his size, who plainly did not care what the town thought of him. Crane weighed it, and his soft mouth made a small motion that was not quite a smile. And he laid one gloved hand flat on his clerk's arm. Otis shut his mouth. $25, said Pruitt into the silence, and his gavel hung in the air a beat longer than it needed to, because even the auctioneer could feel that the morning had slipped its rails. 25, going once. The gavel came down on the head of a nail keg. Sold to Whitaker, $25. He had meant to say 5. The 5 had been the number he expected to be writing when the morning began. Sold $5 to whoever Crane sent that had been the shape of it. Instead, he wrote 25, and the name Whitaker, and across the square the people of Coldwater began slowly. Roan Whitaker came through the crowd, and the crowd opened for him, because that is what crowds do for a big, quiet man with money in his hand, and he climbed the 2 feet up onto nothing, and stood at the foot of the auctioneer's crate, looking up at the woman on it. Della looked down at him and braced herself. She had been braced for 2 years. She knew by now the precise weight of the thing she expected. The proprietary hand, the appraising look, the voice that has just paid and means to be answered. She set her face to receive it. It did not come. What the man did instead, in front of the whole square of Coldwater, in front of Silas Crane and his clerk, and the teamster with the red whiskers and Del Foss, who had bid $1 for a joke, and the children sent up trees for a better view, he took it off the way men take off their hats in church or at a grave. And then, slow, with the care of a heavy man, he went down on one knee on the cold mud of the square, so that for the first time that morning Della Mercer was not below anyone, but above. "Ma'am," he said. The square had gone so quiet that the word reached the back of it. "My name's Roan Whitaker. I run an outfit up the North Road. I've no wish in the world to own a single hour of you." He turned the hat once in his big hands, and he kept his eyes down, the way a man does when he has decided to say a thing all the way through and is afraid that looking up will stop him. "I heard what they meant to do here this morning. I heard who meant to do it, and I could not sit my horse out on that road and let it be done. That's the whole of my business in town today." He looked up then. "The money's paid by the law of it. That buys your work for the season. But I'll not hold you to any law that puts a person on a crate. So I'll say it plain, in front of everybody, so there's no mistaking it later." His voice did not rise, but it reached every soul in that square, and it would be repeated in Coldwater for 30 years. "You're free to go where you please this minute, and owe me nothing. Or, if you've got nowhere, and I think maybe you haven't, you're welcome to come out to my place, where there's a room with a door that locks from the inside, and honest work, and 3 meals, and no man who'll trouble you." That's an offer between 2 grown people. Not a claim. The choosing's yours and yours alone, and I'll stand here with my hat off till you've made it. Up on the crate, Della Mercer found that she could not for the moment see the square at all. The knot in the pine board, the painted feed store letters, the whole grey morning had gone soft and swimming, and she had to press her folded hands hard against her apron to keep her promise, the private one, the one about not weeping where they could see. She did not entirely keep it. One tear got past her. She let it. She had earned it. She looked out over the square at the faces that had laughed, at the man who would have worked the black right out of her, at Silas Crane in his good gloves, with his small, sorry smile gone stiff at last on his face, and then she looked back down at the kneeling man with his hat in his hands, and she found her voice, and she used it, and it came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I'll come." They left Coldwater before noon. Della on the seat of Roan Whitaker's wagon, with her 1 bag and a wooden box that held everything in the world that was still hers, which was not much: her mother's Bible, a few good needles, a tin of buttons, a daguerreotype of a woman she barely remembered. Roan put the box up himself careful, as if it might hold more than it did. And then he climbed up the other side and clucked to the team, and they rolled out of the square, and the people watched them go, and the talking, which had never stopped. For a long time neither of them said anything. The town fell behind. The road bent north and climbed, and the country opened out, rolling and gold and going brown at the edges with the year, and far ahead the mountains stood up blue and white-capped against a sky the color of cold iron. The wind smelled of cured grass and pine and the coming snow. It was beautiful, in the hard, plain way that country is beautiful, and Della had forgotten she was allowed to notice such things. "It's 11 miles, Roan said, after the 3rd or 4th mile. His eyes stayed on the team. "Wanted you to know, so you weren't wondering. The river's at about the halfway. We'll ford it shallow this time of year." "Another mile. There's a man works for me," Roan said. "Asa older fella, been with me since before, been with me a long while. He keeps to the bunkhouse and the barn mostly. He's deaf in the one ear and ornery about it, but there's no harm in him. I'll have told him you're coming by tonight, so he doesn't startle." "All right," said Della again. And then, because the silence after it felt like a thing she was supposed to fill, and because she had been turning one question over and over for 11 miles, she made herself ask it. "Mr. Whitaker." He was quiet so long, she thought he might not answer. "My wife took sick 3 years back," he said at last. "Out at the place there wasn't anybody to help. The road was gone, and the river was up, and I couldn't get a doctor to her in time. And she—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "She died out there, 11 miles from anybody, with just me. Decided I'd kept her out there away from folks, like she was a thing I owned, and didn't want them looking at. That's what they say of me. You'll have heard some of it by now." "I heard some," Della admitted. It wasn't true. He said it flatly without pleading, the way a man states a fact he has stopped expecting anyone to believe. But true don't matter much, once a town's decided. I learned that. I learned it the hard way, 3 years standing. He shook the lines easy over the team. So I knew what I was looking at this morning on that crate. I knew exactly what it was. A town. Deciding about a person and being wrong, and having too good a time to stop and check. I've been the one on the crate, ma'am. I just never had it done so public. I couldn't watch it happen to somebody else and ride on home. That's all. That's the whole of the why. There's nothing in it you need to be afraid of." Della looked at the side of his face, brown and lined, and turned away from her toward the road and the mountains, and something that had been clenched tight in her chest for 2 years eased, just slightly, just enough to notice. "My husband," she said slowly, because it seemed only fair to set down her own truth beside his, "wasn't a good man. I won't speak ill of the dead past what's so. He bought everything we had on borrowed money and a smile, and he never meant to pay any of it back, and when he died it all came due on me. The town thinks I'm a fool who married a swindler, or worse, that I was in it with him. I wasn't. I was just a girl who believed a smile. The debt they auctioned me for this morning, that wasn't even mine, it was his. But somebody had to answer for it." She looked down at her folded hands. "And the man who held the paper offered me a private arrangement, to settle it of the kind a woman understands without it being said. And I put him out of my house. So he put me on the crate." Roan Whitaker's hands tightened on the lines just for a moment, and the iron came into his face that the town had always mistaken for coldness, and that was in fact the opposite of cold, the look of a man who feels a great deal. "Crane," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, I figured something like it." He let out a slow breath through his nose. "Well, you're shut of him now. Whatever the paper says, There's 11 miles, and my name between you and Silas Crane, and that'll hold." He glanced at her, just once, a quick, pale-eyed look and away. "You can put it down, is what I mean. You've been bracing, since the square. I can see it on you. You don't have to. Out, at the place. Nothing's going to come at you there." Della did not answer. But she found somewhere in the next mile that her shoulders had come down from around her ears for the first time since a horse had come home without her husband on it, and that she was crying again, quietly, the kind of crying that is not grief and is not even quite relief, but is the body letting go of something it has held too long. And Roan Whitaker had the grace to keep his eyes on the road and say nothing at all about it, and to slow the team a little so the wind wouldn't be so hard in her face. The place sat in a fold of land where a creek came down off the high ground, sheltered from the worst of the north wind by a stand of pine and a long, low ridge. There was a cabin, well built and tight, with a stone chimney, already breathing smoke because Asa had laid a fire. There was a good barn, bigger than the house, and corrals, and a bunkhouse, and the creek running clear and cold over stones, and beyond it all, the dark timber climbing toward the snow line. It was not a poor man's place. Whatever else the town said of Roan Whitaker, he was no shiftless drifter. He had built something here, with his hands, slow and square, and meant to last. And then he had been left in it alone. Asa came out of the barn as the wagon rolled in, a bow-legged old man with white whiskers and a face like a walnut, who looked Della over without much expression, and then touched the brim of his hat and said, too loud the way the deaf speak, "Ma'am," and went to take the team. That was all. There was a kindness in how little he made of it. Inside, the cabin was clean and bare in the particular way of a house, kept by a man who has stopped expecting to be happy in it. There was a good stove, a table, 2 chairs, a third chair, turned to the wall, as if it had been put out of use on purpose, a bed in the corner behind a curtain, a shelf of a few books. This was going to be. He started, and stopped, and started again. "It's a good room, dry. The window faces the morning. There's a bolt there, on the inside. I put it on this afternoon, before I came to town." He would not look at her while he said it. "I want you to use it. Not because there's any need, because I want you to know it's there, and that it's yours, and that the using of it is up to nobody but you." Della looked at the little iron bolt, new and bright against the old wood, screwed on that very afternoon by a man who had ridden 11 miles to a town that hated him to buy a stranger off a crate. She thought she had used up all her tears for one day. She found she had not. "Thank you," she said. That first night she lay in the narrow bed in the dry room with the morning window, and she shot the bolt, and she lay in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar house, and the wind in the pines, and the creek over its stones, and she waited out of 2 years of hard habit. It never came. Somewhere past midnight she stopped waiting for it, and somewhere after that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Della Mercer slept all the way through until morning. The days found their shape, the way days will. Della cooked, because she could, and because the work was honest and her own. She had not had a kitchen to truly call hers in a long while, and Roan's was a poor, bare thing when she came to it, 2 pots and a skillet, and a larder that told the whole story of a man feeding himself only because the body insists. She set about it the way she set about everything, that fall, quietly, thoroughly, asking little, Within a week the cabin smelled of bread. Within 2 it smelled of stew with wild onion in it, and of dried apple pie, and of coffee made the way coffee ought to be made instead of boiled to tar. Roan said nothing about any of it at first, but she noticed that he started coming in from the work at the same hour each evening, where before, by Asa's account, he had eaten when he remembered to. She noticed that he ate everything she put in front of him, slowly, with a kind of attention, as if a meal were a thing that could be paid the courtesy of being noticed. She noticed one evening that the third chair, the one that had been turned to the wall, was turned back to the table again, and that no one had said a word about it, and that Asa now came up from the bunkhouse to eat with them of an evening, scrubbed and combed, hollering his half-deaf opinions about horses across the table, so that the cabin, which had been a silent place, was of a sudden a place with talk in it. She learned the man slowly, in pieces, the way you learn weather. She learned that Roan Whitaker was gentle with animals past the point of any other man she'd known, that he had a half-broke filly he was bringing along by patience, alone, never the whip, talking to it low across the corral fence in that same carrying voice he'd used in the square. She learned that he could not abide cruelty in any form, and could not say so out loud, so that when a neighbor's boy came by once dragging a half-starved dog on a rope, Roan said nothing at all, only bought the dog for $1 and fed it and let it follow him, and would not discuss the matter. She learned that he read at night, slow, moving his lips a little over the hard words, and was ashamed of it, and that she could mend this shame by simply asking him, as if it were nothing, to read a passage aloud while she sewed, so that the reading became a thing they did, and he learned her. He learned that she sang under her breath, when she thought no one could hear, old songs, sad ones, and that she stopped the instant she was noticed, so that he trained himself to never let on that he heard. He learned that she was strong, stronger than the black dress and the bowed head in the square had let the town see, that she could split kindling and haul water and doctor a sick calf with her sleeves rolled, and he learned that she flinched still the first few weeks, when he moved too quick or spoke too sudden, and that the flinch was a thing put into her by somebody, and he set himself, without ever saying so, to move slow and speak even around her until the flinch went out of her on its own. By the time the first real snow came down off the mountains and lay white over the yard, the flinch was mostly gone. They did not speak of what they were to each other. There was no need yet, and naming a thing too early can frighten it off. There was a widow and a widower, and an old deaf man and a half-broke filly, and a dog with no name, all of them in one warm fold of land, while the snow came down, and that was enough to be going on with, and both of them knew, without saying, that it was the most enough either of them had felt in years. The trouble that winter, when it came from 2 directions at once, the way trouble does. The first was a blizzard. It came down in the 3rd week of December, a true mountain blizzard. 3 days of white wind that buried the corral rails and stopped the creek and made the 11 miles to Coldwater into something nobody would attempt and live. They were shut in, the 3 of them and the animals, in the warm fold of land with the snow piling against the windows, and in the middle of it Asa took a fever. It was a bad one. The old man's chest filled and rattled, and he burned and shook by turns, and there was no doctor in the world that weather, and Della saw in Roan Whitaker's face, the second night, a look she recognized. Tell. 11 miles from help with the road gone, it was the look of a man about to be broken in the exact spot he had already been broken once. Della did not let it happen. She had nursed before, her own mother, through a long dying, and others in the orphanage town she'd grown up in, where a girl learned to be useful or learned nothing. She put Roan to work hauling snow to melt and keeping the fire fierce. She stripped Asa and sponged the fever down when it climbed and packed him warm when it dropped. She made a steam of pine pitch and hot water and got the old man's head over it under a blanket until the rattle in his chest loosened. She brewed willow bark she'd had the foresight to gather and dry in the fall, and got it into him a spoonful at a time through his teeth when he was too far gone to swallow on purpose. She sat up with him the whole of 2 nights, and on the 3rd night near dawn the fever broke, and Asa came back to himself weak as water, and twice as cantankerous, and demanded to know who'd been at his whiskers with a sponge. Roan Whitaker stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse in the grey dawn light, having not slept, having watched a woman do with her 2 hands the thing he had not been able to do for his wife, and something came over his face that he could not set aside the way he set everything aside, and he had to turn and go out into the snow for a while before he could speak to anybody. When he came back in, he stood by the stove, where Della was finally letting herself sit exhausted, past speaking, a cup of her own good coffee going cold in her hands. "He'd have died," Roan said. "Without you, he'd have died, and I'd have buried a second one in the same ground, and the town would have had its second story about me." His voice was not steady. I'm not a man who's good with saying things, you'll have noticed, but I want it set down between us, plain, that what you are isn't anything that town ever knew how to see. You're not a thing that gets sold off a crate. You're the best." He stopped, started over, simpler. "There's not a better person come to this place in my life. Only one ever equaled it, and she's in the ground, and I never thought I'd say such a thing about a living soul again. That's all. That's all I wanted," said Della, looked up at him, this big, silent man undone in his own bunkhouse doorway, and she set down the cold coffee, and she stood, and she did a thing she had not planned. She crossed the small space between them, and she put her arms around him, and laid her head against his chest, where she could hear the heart of him going hard and frightened under all that stillness. He went rigid for a moment, the way a half-broke thing does when it is first touched, gentle. And then his arms came up slow, the way everything in him was slow, and they closed around her, careful as if she was something that might be broken by holding. And the 2 of them stood like that in the grey winter morning, with old Asa pretending to be asleep 10 feet away, because there was nothing else that needed saying just then. That was the first direction the trouble came from, and it ended well. The second direction was Silas Crane, and it had been building since the gavel came down in October. A man like Silas Crane does not lose a thing in public and forget it. He had been made small in the square, outbid, outstared, made to lay his gloved hand on his own clerk's arm and yield in front of the whole town, to a man he considered beneath him. And he had watched, through the fall, the talk of Coldwater turn slowly against the grain he had spent 2 years laying down, because that is what happened. People began to tell the story of the auction differently than Crane wished it told. They began to tell it as the morning the cold widower took off his hat and knelt in the mud and freed the widow Crane meant to ruin, and rode her out of town to honest work and a door that bolted from the inside. It became a story people liked, and every time it was told, Silas Crane got a little smaller in it, and he could feel it, and it ate at him through the long winter the way the cold eats at a fence post, slow, from the ground up. So Silas Crane went looking through his papers. He was a patient man and a thorough one, and he held the notes on half the county, and somewhere in the drift of paper that had come to him out of Carl Mercer's ruined estate, he found what he was looking for. A piece of it, anyway, A quarter section of the very bottomland Carl Mercer had bought and lost, a quarter section whose title had never been cleanly settled because Carl Mercer never did anything cleanly, and which, by a reading of the law that only a man with a banker's patience might be argued to have passed. Not back to the bank, but to the widow, as part of a homestead claim Carl had filed and let lapse, and that might yet be revived. It was thin. Crane knew it was thin. But he did not need it to win in a court. He needed it to drag Della Mercer back into Coldwater, in front of people, into a room with him, where the matter of her debt and her deed and her person could be made complicated and frightening and long, and where a frightened woman with no money and no standing might be brought at last to the private arrangement she had refused him in her parlor, to settle it all, quietly, of the kind a woman understands. He did not want the land. He had never wanted the land. He wanted to win the thing he had lost. He sent the first letter in February by a rider who made it out the 11 miles on the hard crust of the snow. It was very polite. It regretted to inform the widow Mercer that a question had arisen as to certain real property, that her presence was required in town to settle the matter, that failure to appear might prejudice her interests. Roan read it twice slow, moving his lips over the lawyer's words. Then he set it down on the table very carefully, as if it were something that might go off. "He means to get you back in town," Roan said. "Yes," said Della. She had gone pale, but her chin was at its old level, the level from the crate. "He means to frighten me into the thing I wouldn't do before. He doesn't want any land. He wants me to come crawling, so the town sees me crawl. So he gets back what he lost in the square." "Then you won't go," said Roan. "If I don't go, he says it prejudices my interests. Let it. What's he going to take? You've got nothing he can reach out here." Della was quiet a moment. "I've got my name," she said. "It's about all I've got, and it's in poor shape, but it's mine, and if I don't answer him, he'll write it up that I ran from a lawful summons, that I'm hiding out here, that we're—" She did not finish. She did not have to. They both knew the word. The town would reach for about a widow and a widower alone in a fold of land all winter, and they both knew that Silas Crane would be the one to hand the town the word. Roan Whitaker sat with that for a long minute. Then he stood up and got his coat. "Then we'll both go," he said, "when the road opens, and we'll settle it in the open in front of the same town that watched the first of it, not in his office. In the open. He likes the town watching. Let's see how he likes it watching this." The road opened in the second week of March, in a false warm spell that turned the snow to mud and ran the creek high and brown. They drove in together, Roan and Della on the wagon seat, and they did not go to Silas Crane's office. They went to the square. And because Coldwater is Coldwater, and because word had gone ahead the way it always does, there was a crowd in the square, again by the time they got there, the same crowd, near enough, that had stood there in October, the same teamster, the same Del Foss, the same children. Silas Crane came out of his office in his good coat and his good gloves, with his lawyer and his clerk Otis behind him, and the two parties faced each other across the mud, and for a moment it was October again, the woman and the banker, except that this time the woman was not on a crate. This time she stood on her own 2 feet in the open square with a big, quiet man beside her, who had not moved an inch from her side, and the difference in it was plain to everyone there. Crane began, as Crane always began, soft and sorry and reasonable. He spoke of the deed, of the lapsed homestead claim, of the regrettable complications of the late Mr. Dew, Mercer's affairs, of his own earnest wish, his only wish, to see the matter settled fairly and the widow's interests protected. He spoke for some time. He was good at it. He built with soft words a thing that sounded like generosity and was a noose, and Della felt the old town leaning in, half ready to believe him, because a town will always half believe the man who holds the paper. And then Della Mercer spoke, and she surprised them all, because the woman who had stood mute on the crate in October was not mute anymore. A winter in a warm house with a bolt on her own door, and her own work in her own hands, and a man who moved slow and spoke even had given her back something the town had taken. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She had learned that from watching Roan. "There's no homestead claim, Mr. Crane," she said, "and you know it, because you read the papers closer than any man alive, before you sent that letter. My husband let that claim lapse 2 years before he died. There's nothing to revive. You haven't got a case, and you never thought you had one. What you've got is a winter's worth of being made small in this square, and a wish to drag me back into a room alone with you, to settle it the way you wanted to settle it the day you sat in my parlor with your hat on your knee and offered me an arrangement I think these folks would like to hear about." The square went very still. "I put you out of my house that day," Della said into the stillness, "and you put me on that crate to teach me what it cost to say no to Silas Crane. Well, here's the lesson, and it's mine to give, not yours. I said no in my parlor where nobody could hear. I'll say it again right here where everybody can know. There's no deed, there's no arrangement. There's no debt of mine you haven't been paid for 10 times over in the pleasure you took watching me stand up there in October. It's done. I'm done." And I think she looked, for the first time around the whole square, at the faces that had laughed and the faces that were not laughing now. I think this town knows the difference, finally, between the two of us. I think it's known a while, and just needed to hear it said out loud. It was Pruitt, the auctioneer, of all people, who broke it. Pruitt, who had brought the gavel down on the crate in October and had not slept easy about it since, cleared his throat in the silence and said to Crane, not loud, but loud enough, "She's right about the claim, Silas. I clerked that filing myself. It lapsed. There's no land in it. Never was." And having said it, having finally set down the small stone of truth he'd been carrying all winter, the old auctioneer looked for a moment 10 years younger, and the square, which had leaned toward Crane, leaned away from him. You could feel it move. A town is a slow animal, and a cowardly one, and it will follow the paper a long way, but there comes a moment when it sees the man holding the paper plain, and is ashamed of how far it followed, and turns all at once like a school of fish. That moment came for Silas Crane in the Coldwater Square on a muddy morning in March, and he was banker enough to feel it the instant it came, and to know that the thing he had been chasing all winter was not only lost, but had cost him something he could not get back, the town's belief that he was the reasonable one. He had spent that, all of it, to drag a woman back into a square, and she had not crawled, and now he stood in the mud, with his good gloves and his thin paper, and a town looking at him the way it had looked at her in October. He did the only thing a man like that can do. He gathered his coat, and his lawyer, and his clerk, and his small, sorry smile, gone stiff and useless now, and he went back into his office and shut the door, and that was the end of Silas Crane's hold on the matter, and the beginning, though it took a few years, of the end of his hold on Coldwater altogether. They drove back north in the long light of the afternoon, the road running with snow melt, the mountains shedding their winter a little at the edges, the air gone soft for the first time in months with the far-off promise of spring. For a good while neither of them spoke. It was a different silence than the one on the road out in October. That had been the silence of two strangers, each braced against the other. This was the silence of two people who have just been through a thing together and are letting it settle, and there is no loneliness in a silence like that. It is one of the warmest things there is. About the halfway, at the ford, Roan pulled the team up to let them drink, and the water ran clear and cold and loud over the stones, and he sat with the lines loose in his hands and looked at the water for a while, and then he said, not looking at her, in that low carrying voice that had stopped a square twice now, the season's near up. Della's heart went still. What season? The one I paid for. October to March. That's a season by the old reckoning of the vendue. $25. Bought your work till spring. Spring's about here. So by the law of the thing, the law I told you in the square I'd never hold you to, and I meant it, you're free. Whatever you ever owed, you've paid it back 100 times in a hard winter. You don't owe me a season or a day or a single hour. You can go anywhere you've a mind to go. I'd see you settled somewhere decent. I've got the means to do that much, and I'd be glad to. He stopped. The water ran. The team drank. That's the one half of what I've got to say, Roan said, and I said it first, on purpose, so you'd know the other half doesn't have any law behind it, nor any debt, nor anything but the plain truth of a man who isn't good at this. He turned, finally, and looked at her. The full, pale, steady look, no hat to take off this time. Nothing between them but the cold, clean air over the ford. I don't want you to go, Della. I haven't wanted you to go since about the second week you were under my roof, and I've been ashamed to say it all winter, for fear you'd think it was the thing you were brought there for, and it isn't. It's the opposite of that. It's— his voice caught. You gave me my house back. You gave me old Asa's life. And you gave me back a thing in myself I'd buried with Ada and never thought to see again. I'm not asking for the work of your hands. I'm asking for— I'd like the big man who could gentle a half-broke filly with his voice alone, sat at the ford and could not find the word, and so he set the lines down entirely. And he said the simplest true thing he had. Stay as my wife. If you have a hard, quiet man who lives too far from town and isn't good with words, stay because you want to. That's all I've got. That's the whole of it. Della Mercer looked at her hand inside his two big scarred ones, and she looked at the water running clear over the stones, and she thought about a parlor and a crate and a bolt screwed bright onto an old door by a man who rode 11 miles to a town that hated him because he could not watch a stranger be sold. She took her time. He had taught her all winter that she was allowed to take her time, that no one would hurry her, that the choosing was hers, and hers alone. So she took it. The team drank. The water ran. The mountains let go of a little more of their snow. Yes, she said at last, quietly and completely, with nothing held back, the way she'd said it on the crate in October, and meant a different thing entirely. That's what I want. I'll stay. He let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding since about October, and his head bowed a little, the way it had bowed at the foot of the crate, and his hands tightened just slightly around hers, and the ford ran on, and that was all. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. They were married in the spring by the circuit preacher, at the ranch and not in town, with old Asa standing up beside Roan, in a collar that was strangling him, and the no-name dog underfoot, and the half-broke filly broke now. A few people came out from Coldwater, not many, but a few, the ones who had turned in the square, the ones who'd needed the lesson said out loud, and had been honest enough to learn it. He brought a wedding gift of a good iron skillet, and would not quite meet Della's eye when he gave it, and she took his hand and thanked him plainly, and forgave him, without making him say the thing he couldn't say because she had learned at Grace that winter from a man who'd never had it shown to him, and gave it anyway. The seasons turned, the way they do. The bottomland was no part of their life. Crane could keep his thin paper. They had the fold of land where the creek came down, and the good barn, and the tight cabin, and they made it into the thing a house is supposed to be, and so seldom is. There came to be children, in time, 2 of them, and the third chair that had once been turned to the wall was the least of the chairs they needed before long. There came to be a sound in that cabin that had been missing from it for 3 lonely years before Della, and had been missing from her for 2 hard ones before Roan. The ordinary, unremarkable, miraculous sound of a family at supper, talking, all at once in a warm room, with bread in the oven, and the dark timber climbing toward the snow line outside the morning window. And once in a great while of an evening, when the children were down and the fire was low and Asa had gone off to the bunkhouse, Roan Whitaker would look at his wife across the table. At this woman the town of Coldwater had once stood up on a crate and tried to sell for the price of a joke. Mud, and what it had cost him to do it, and what it had bought, which was not a season of anybody's labor but the rest of his own life, made warm and full, and worth the having, and he never once thought he had paid too much. $5.25, a winter of his patience, and the whole of his buried heart. For all of that, he'd think, watching her bank the fire, he had gotten back more than any man has a right to, and the bargain had been so lopsided in his favor that he was half ashamed of it, and wholly grateful every single day. On the shelf by the morning window where the late light came in warm and rested, Della kept her mother's Bible and her tin of buttons, and beside them a thing she had asked Roan for one day with no explanation, and that he had given her without asking why. She had never needed to use it but the one first night, but she kept it where she could see it, not as a memory of fear, as a reminder of the one thing a man had given her before he gave her anything else, before he had any reason to expect a thing in return, a door that locked from the inside, and the choosing of when to open it, and the slow, unhurried discovery that out here, in the warm fold of land where the creek came down, she would never once need to lock it against the man who'd hung it. And that was the story of Della, a woman they put up on a crate to sell for the price of a joke, who came down off it with her name in poor shape and her heart in worse, and who found, 11 miles up a cold north road, in the house of a man, the town had thrown away same as her every single thing that the square had told her she would never have again. If this one warmed you on a cold day, if you believe, like I do, that the people a town throws away are so often the very ones worth keeping, then do me a kindness and let me know in the comments. Tap that like button and subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like Della's and Roan's coming, of the gentle and the cast out and the quietly good, and I would surely love to have you here by the fire when they do. Thank you truly for listening. Take care of yourselves out there.